Welcome back and welcome to video number 3 of part 2. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the idea of making connections. So really quick recap, in our first video, we really focused on limited capacity and understanding how much information a student can really feasibly obtain and consume in a remote learning environment. Video number 2, we took an exploration into the idea of time. What are those time segments? Like how long can a student really be engaged in either a synchronous or an asynchronous setting, depending on the context of the learning? For this particular video, we're going to carry on with this idea of, again, remembering amount of information, how long, but also how can we make sure that our students are really bridging and making connections with the learning. To help us really think about this concept, I want to introduce you to the idea of elaboration. And as I've mentioned in the other videos, you do have access to these slides. I would encourage you to access this article because it's a great article that just goes into a lot more detail about elaboration. But for our purposes today, we're going to focus specifically on elaboration for remote learning. Elaboration refers to expanding a concept to be more detailed, allowing our brain to connect multiple concepts to one central idea. To put this a little bit more into context, an example, the young lady on the left, the young student, she may very easily just be sitting there doing her assignment, but she could be thinking about 1,000 other things while she's doing it. Versus the little girl on the right, she is making a very intentional deliberate action to elaborate on her own learning. So this is where a student would be saying to themselves, okay, now I'm going to add these two numbers together and carry to the tens place. So again, she is intentionally thinking through the learning process, allowing her brain to fully make connections with one step to the next. To put it in the context of secondary students, again, the young man on the left, he's not self-explaining. He could simply be going through the motions. It could be a memorization task, whatever it is, he's just simply working through it. Versus when he's been asked to very clearly elaborate, in his brain, he's probably thinking, so now I'm going to create a graph that shows the elapsed time between each experiment to help me write a concluding statement. He is intentionally thinking through the learning process. So he is making connections with what he's doing right now to something that he's potentially going to generate or produce in the future. To help put this a little bit more in a frame of reference of remote learning, with elaboration, it is very difficult for teachers in a remote learning setting to always know if students are making the connections, especially if students are doing a blended model of asynchronous instruction with synchronous instruction, or if teachers only maybe see the students 1 or 2 days a week and then the remainder of their time is in a remote setting. The issue with elaboration is that unless you deliberately teach the students the art of elaboration, it's not a fair assumption to make that they automatically know how to do this. So a couple of things that you could coach teachers on ways that they could really help students learn the concept of elaboration, but also really expand upon it. One is encouraging the students to take a topic and to talk about it out loud. This could be where they talk about out loud to themselves, with a friend, with a sibling, with a parent, with a family member, whatever might work. This is also a great space that the jigsaw protocol can come into play. This could be utilized in a synchronous setting where you ask students to role play as the teacher. So it could be you give a very specific topic, you could let the students choose the topic, but they in turn teach the class that concept. This is a way for them to really bridge connections and to put it in a frame of reference that makes sense to them, that they can explain back to their peers. However, it's also a great informal assessment for teachers because they can stop and start to recognize where gaps may exist as they're listening to the student explain the topic to the class. Another great tool is Flipgrid. I'm sure several of you are familiar with Flipgrid. It's a great resource that allows students to do short video recordings. What's great about Flipgrid is that a student can record themselves talking through their thought process. It could purely be for them to go back and replay, but it's also a great resource for teachers. This is something that very young students can do all the way up into secondary. And it's really going to depend on how you frame the questions. So a question could be, how do I apply this topic in my life? That's what you would be asking them, or the prompt that you would give them that you want them to respond to in the Flipgrid. Again, for younger students, it might be as simple as, how do I consume energy every day? Or how can I make sure that I'm not using as many lights in my house? Or how can I maybe not use as much water every day? So again, it's all about the prompt. It's how the teacher positions it, but it gives the students the opportunities to bridge connections with things that maybe they've been learning about. Another great way to think about elaboration, but also to bring together the retrieval practice that we talked about in the previous video, is the idea of concept mapping. Concept mapping is not new. It has been ingrained in education for years and years and years, but now might be the time to revisit it with teachers who are teaching in a remote learning environment to help them bridge the connection between the retrieval practice and elaboration. Again, the process is all about teaching our students how to think, how to understand how they learn, but in the process, helping our teachers identify and understand how our students are learning so that they can help to bridge the gaps. The great thing about concept mapping is it also allows learners to identify what they know and where the gaps are, in addition to the relationships between concepts, so they can really serve multiple purposes. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach concept mapping. This is a really low-tech version. So the one on the left, it is all paper and sticky notes. So if you have a student who has very limited access to technology, maybe they're sharing a device, they don't have access to it long enough to really build out a concept map, or they are just not ready to tackle concept mapping on a device, you can absolutely have them draw it out and take a photograph and send it to you. Or it could be something that they turn in if they're working through paper packets. So the one on the left is more of kind of an elementary example. It looks like they're doing some math with lowest common denominators or multiples. And then the one on the right is a little bit more complex. So it looks like maybe the teacher gave an initial template and then the student wrote into the spaces their connections with lines. Utilizing technology, you absolutely have the ability to go out and use a variety of different tools that are available that allow students to create their own concept maps. The other great thing about concept mapping is it can absolutely be done individually, or it can be done in pairs or in small groups. Again, depending on access to technology, you have the ability to assign concept maps to groups where they're all going in and contributing together. So again, this is helping them to make those connections with the things that they've been learning to new concepts and future concepts that might be introduced. Here are just a couple of tools. Again, there are a variety out there that support concept mapping. These are just a few that I've personally used that worked really well for my students. One is Popplet. Again, I've kind of pulled two examples directly from their website so you can get an idea of what students have the capacity to be able to do. Again, they can go really broad with their concept maps, or they can keep it relatively small. It all has to do with what you're looking for, but also reminding them it's about the elaboration process. They need to build it out as much as they need to in order to fully understand the concept and make those connections. Here are a couple of other tools that I've utilized, Bubble.us, Lucidchart, Creately, but there's also Google Docs. You can absolutely create concept maps within Google Docs. You can also do it within slides. I've done it many, many times, and my own girls in 5th grade have done it. So again, lots of different options, different ways that you could introduce concept mapping to your students, really depending on their comfort level with the technology and how in-depth and robust you want the concept map to be. So really quickly, this was a really quick video, again, all about giving you information in small portions, but I do want to take a minute to reflect before we close out on this video. For this particular reflection, how might you introduce the concept of elaboration to a teacher focused on direct instruction in remote learning? So you have that teacher that you've tried absolutely everything, but every single time you join their synchronous sessions or their asynchronous sessions, it is predominantly them talking to the students. They aren't really giving the students the opportunity to process the understanding and bridge connections. or you're not really seeing it in the assignments that they're giving to the students. They're still providing assignments at a very low level of Bloom's, not really ensuring that students are making the connections that they need in order to really move forward with the concept or with the unit. So take some time to think about, how would you introduce this concept? How would you kind of frame it in your own words if you really needed to introduce it to a teacher, or just to help a teacher grow in their understanding of how to effectively teach in a remote learning environment? So that wraps up our third video. Again, be sure to go out, add some reflections, look at the guided questions within the action plan guide that you've been given, as well as the discussion forum. And when you're ready, you can head into our final video in this module, which will be video number 4, which will focus on utilizing visuals.